The Hero's Journey, or Monomyth, is a storytelling template originally developed by Joseph Campbell, listing a series of steps that work as a structural guideline for stories to follow. Some of the most popular works of fiction of all time, such as the writings of Tolkien, seem to fit within the monomyth almost perfectly. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of a story that seems to follow the hero's journey is Star Wars. The story of a boy living in a familiar world who is thrust into an adventure where he faces trials, meets allies, and returns having grown. It seems fitting, then, that with the premiere of Season 2, I want to look at the first season of the Disney Plus series The Mandalorian and analyze its structure when viewed through the lens of the monomyth. I'll specifically be using Christopher Vogler's interpretation of the monomyth, which follows the same basic structure, though simplified from 17 steps into 12. I won't necessarily be looking at all 12 steps here, only those that are specifically relevant, because I believe this template should be used as a guideline, not a strict rule set. The first step of the hero's journey is the ordinary world. At the start of the story, the protagonist exists in a world with which he or she is familiar. He is used to this life, he understands it, and he is at least somewhat comfortable with it, even if he doesn't necessarily enjoy it. Like with many serialized shows, Episode 1 of The Mandalorian is almost entirely dedicated to establishing and showing the audience the ordinary world. We learn who our main character is, what his life is like, and get some insight into his background. Our main character is a Mandalorian, who works as a bounty hunter, and through both dialogue and action, we're shown that he's very skilled. We learn information that will become important later, like that he hates droids,
No droids.
and get a few tidbits about his backstory, like the fact that he is a foundling, though we're not exactly told what this means. Besides our main character, we also learn about the status of the galaxy in the years following Return of the Jedi. The Empire is now in shambles, and it's become more difficult for bounty hunters to find work. The Mandalorian people live underground due to an event called the Great Purge, which is left mostly ambiguous. All this exposition works together to create the ordinary world. Note that, despite the name, the ordinary world has less to do with a physical location and more with the living situation. We're learning what the protagonist's life is like before he embarks on his journey. In this case, the ordinary world is not where we first see Mando, but what he normally does. After we see the Mandalorian complete his first job, he returns to the Bounty Hunters Guild to accept another. We find that his client is part of the recently fractured Empire. Based on this and the other unique circumstances of this bounty, it becomes clear to the audience that this mission is going to be unique and will most likely create a significant change in the plot. But in the context of the season overall, we haven't left the ordinary world yet, because we're still just watching the Mandalorian do his job. The rest of the episode shows the completion of this mission. Mandalorian runs into some trouble, fights some guys, and eventually gets where he needs to be. He finds the asset, and it's revealed to be a baby. This marks a turning point in the story, and the transition into the call to adventure is when the protagonist of the story is met with the possibility of leaving the ordinary world and entering an unfamiliar one to begin the journey. In The Mandalorian, the journey, the thing that the rest of the story is going to be about, is protecting the child. The final moments of Episode 1 show the bounty droid attempting to kill the child.
The commission was quite specific. The asset was to be terminated.
Mando chooses to save it instead. This marks the start of the call to adventure because it is the first point where Mando shows some emotional connection with the child. Note him reaching out to it. A desire to keep it safe. And Episode 2 is about building this connection, opening the possibility that the Mandalorian can choose to protect the child and begin his adventure instead of turning it in. The first scene of this episode is the Mandalorian defending the child from a group of bounty hunters attempting to take it. Though he is currently defending the child so he can collect the bounty on it himself, the scene and the rest of the episode are here to establish a rapport between the two, to create some kind of relationship between Mando and the child so that later he will have difficulty giving it up. When it sees he is injured, the child reaches out to him, which we will later learn is an attempt to heal the wound. The Mandalorian ship is taken apart, and in order to repair it, he needs to retrieve an egg for the Jawas. Though, at first glance, this episode can feel a bit like filler, by having his ship damaged and being required to complete this errand, Mando is forced to spend more time with the child, and, as a result, grow more attached to it. He is forced to act as its father.
Hey, spit that out.
Before he can get the egg, the Mandalorian is attacked by a large beast. The child uses the Force to save him. Now, not only does he have a somewhat paternal instinct to protect the child, but Mando also feels indebted to it for saving his life. He repairs the ship and goes on his way, leading into
You must learn the ways of the Force if you're to come with me to Alderaan.
Alderaan? I'm not going to Alderaan. I've got to get home. It's late. I'm in port as it is.
I need your help, Luke. She needs your help.
The refusal of the call is the point in the story where the protagonist hears the call to adventure and ignores it, choosing to stay in the ordinary world instead. In Episode 3, despite feeling somewhat attached to it,
Easy with that.
the Mandalorian brings the child back to the Imperials who hired him. The call to adventure was his instinct to protect the child, and he refuses that call by giving the child away. He chooses instead to remain a bounty hunter, thus staying in his ordinary world. He collects the reward and goes on his way. The refusal of the call, however, is always temporary. The amount of time it lasts may differ, but it always eventually leads to the crossing of the threshold, where the character chooses to accept the call to adventure and takes his first step into the unknown world. After giving up the child, it becomes clear the Mandalorian feels a sense of guilt.
What are your plans for it?
This is a callback to the earlier line,
I have no idea if he wants to eat it or hang it on his wall, but he's very antsy.
Mando knows that by giving it up, he is most likely resigning the child to a terrible fate, and the following moment where he acts as a paternal figure to it once again reminds the audience of their connection. Later, flashbacks to Mando's own childhood show his guilt stems from some sense of empathy, having his own home and people slaughtered as a boy. He spends several more scenes questioning his decision before finally deciding to go back for the child. The rest of the episode is one incredible action sequence where he goes on a mission to save it from the Empire. By recovering the child, Mando crosses the threshold, accepting the call to adventure. The next step in the hero's journey is tests, allies, and enemies. At this part of the story, the protagonist is faced with multiple smaller tests on the road to achieving his goal. He meets new characters, some of whom become allies and others who become enemies. Episodes 4, 5, and 6 of the show represent this portion of the journey. In these episodes, the Mandalorian continues his journey of protecting the child, all the while facing new threats and finding new allies. The challenges faced in these episodes are mostly inconsequential to the overall plot, serving mostly to introduce new characters and develop character relationships. Here is the point in the story where the protagonist prepares to face his greatest challenge. He collects the allies gained from the previous step, and together they move toward a larger threat than they have previously encountered. In Episode 7, the Mandalorian is called back by his old boss, Greef Karga, who previously tried to take the child from him in Episode 3. Karga offers a job where the Mandalorian can kill the client who has been sending hunters after him, and his name will be cleared. Sensing a trap, Mando calls upon Kuiil and Cara Dune to accompany him. They meet up with Karga, and the group approaches a town now occupied by Imperials. The heroes create a plan where they attempt to trick the Imperials into thinking they are turning in the child as a way of killing the client. This plan fails, however, when a larger Imperial force arrives and traps them. This begins the final stages of the journey. The final steps of the hero's journey see the hero complete his quest. After the approach, the protagonist must face the ordeal, his toughest challenge. This may mean coming to terms with his greatest fear or facing death itself. The Mandalorian, with the help of his allies, fights back against the Imperials. Together, they manage to escape the trap set for them, but at a cost. The Mandalorian is seriously injured, and in order to survive, he must overcome his hatred of droids by allowing one to remove his helmet, something he has never allowed another to do. Following the ordeal, the protagonist claims the reward. For facing all of the challenges thus far, the protagonist earns something, whether that be a physical possession or some new insight. While escaping the Empire, the Mandalorian comes across the Mandalorian Armorer, who has acted as a type of mentor to him thus far. In this scene, she grants him his signet, a symbol of honor and courage in battle used to identify a Mandalorian as part of a clan. In his time defending the child, the Mandalorian has grown and thus earned his right to his own signet, as well as the jetpack. The road back is the point in the story where the protagonist, having gained the reward, prepares to complete the journey. Here, the heroes take the lava tunnel to complete the mission, but before they can make it out, they are faced with the resurrection. The resurrection is the final challenge the protagonist must face before the journey is complete. It is the climax, often requiring the protagonist to use the lesson learned throughout the story to pass this final test. When Moff Gideon attacks a group of heroes, the Mandalorian uses the jetpack he was given to save his allies. This leads to the final step, the return with the elixir. Finally, having overcome all trials, the protagonist either returns to his home or sets off on a new adventure, bringing with him the reward he has earned and lessons learned. At the end of Episode 8, the hero has successfully saved the child and stopped the Imperial forces trying to steal it, thus completing his journey. He has earned his signet, solidifying himself as a true Mandalorian warrior. The episode concludes with the Mandalorian beginning a new journey to bring the child back to its own kind. If you look at the season as a whole, that's how the story breaks down. However, each episode is a story in and of itself. Look at the hero's journey episode by episode, and you'll find it still follows the same basic structure. For example, Episode 1. The Ordinary World is the first mission where the Mandalorian takes in his bounty. The Call to Adventure is when he is told about the job. Crossing the Threshold is when he goes to the planet. There are tests, allies, and enemies. The Approach is when he approaches the encampment where the child is held. The Ordeal is the battle to get the child, and the reward is finding the child. In Episode 2, the New Ordinary World is introduced here. The Call to Adventure, the refusal of the call,
I'm not gonna trade anything. These are my parts. They stole them from me.
Crossing the Threshold, Approach the Inmost Cave, the Ordeal, the Reward, the Road Back, the Return with the Elixir. The same formula can be applied, with varying degrees of accuracy, to every episode of the show. Alternatively, if you look at this season as just the first part of a series, then Crossing the Threshold is here, when Mando agrees to bring the child back to its kind, because it marks the beginning of that journey.
You must reunite it with its own kind.
Where?
This you must determine.
You expect me to search the galaxy for the home of this creature and deliver it to a race of enemy sorcerers?
This is the way.
So regardless of whether you look at the show in terms of individual episodes, a season, or an entire series, the structure of a full story is there, at least in some capacity. The same could be said for many other movies, books, and television series. When viewed with these storytelling structures in mind, one can find many similarities in stories that seem vastly different.